While I was losing my hair in a chemo chair, my sister was in my bed. I didn't know it yet. I was busy counting ceiling tiles and trying to keep down a cracker between rounds of nausea, and 3 miles away, in the house I'd lived in for 14 years, my husband and my little sister were building a life that didn't include me, on the assumption that I wouldn't be around long enough to notice. By the time I found out, she had already moved a piece of my own money into an account with her name on it, next to mine, without ever asking. This is the story of how I found out, and what I did once I understood exactly what I was looking at. Everyone assumes this is a story about a husband and a sister. It isn't, not really, or at least not only that. It's a story about paperwork nobody thought a sick woman would ever be well enough to read again. 3 questions sat underneath everything that happened to me that year, and I didn't get real answers to any of them until I was almost done with treatment. How long had it actually been going on before I ever got sick? What exactly did my sister take that had nothing to do with my husband at all? And whether the two betrayals, the marriage and the money, were ever really separate things, or whether one had simply been waiting for the other one to arrive. I met Todd 19 years ago at a cookout thrown by a mutual friend neither of us talks to anymore. He was the guy flipping burgers who kept undercooking them on purpose, so he'd have an excuse to keep standing near the grill and near me. He coached a rec league on Saturday mornings for kids who weren't even his own. He fixed our neighbor's fence for free this summer after her husband passed, just because he noticed it needed fixing and figured she had enough on her plate. People liked Todd. I liked Todd. For 18 of our 19 years together, I would have told you, without hesitating, that I married the right man. My sister Vanessa is 4 years younger than me, and for most of our lives, she was the person I trusted before I trusted anyone else. She's the one who drove me to my very first mammogram, sat in the waiting room the whole time doing a crossword she never actually finished because she kept looking up every time the door opened. We weren't the kind of sisters who competed with each other. We were the kind who showed up. That's important to understand, because it's the only reason what happened later worked as well as it did. Nobody watches for a threat that's never given them a single reason to look twice. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Stage 3, the doctor said, and then a lot of words after that I don't fully remember, because the room got very quiet and very loud at the same time in a way I still can't explain properly to anyone who hasn't sat in that exact chair. Treatment would start within 3 weeks. Todd held my hand in the parking lot afterward and didn't say anything for a long time, which from him was its own kind of promise. Vanessa, when we told her that night, didn't hesitate for a second. She said she'd move in for a few months, help with the house, help with anything we needed, so I could focus on getting better and not on anything else. I said yes to a lot of things that year. I was too tired to think hard about most of them. A few weeks into treatment, foggy from the first rounds of chemo, Vanessa sat on the edge of my bed one afternoon and asked, gently, if she should just start handling the mail and the bills herself, so I wouldn't have to think about any of it while I was resting. I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking I was lucky to have a sister who would do that for me without being asked twice. I had no idea, sitting there in that fog, that I had just handed her the one thing she actually needed from me. The wrongness built slowly enough that I mistook it for exhaustion for months. Todd was home less. When he was home, he was somewhere else in his head, short with me in ways he'd never been before, distracted during conversations that used to hold his full attention without effort. I told myself it was the stress of watching his wife go through treatment, that men process fear differently, that I didn't have the energy to examine every mood shift in a house where I could barely stand up some mornings without help. Vanessa, meanwhile, became almost too helpful to question. She started taking calls that used to come to me directly. She began answering Todd's texts on his behalf, she told me, so I could rest instead of being interrupted. She intercepted mail before I ever saw it, sorting it into piles she said she'd already handled. I want to be honest about something most people don't expect to hear in a story like this. I was grateful. I was so tired that having fewer decisions to make felt like mercy, not danger. The discovery didn't happen the way you'd expect. No dramatic walk-in, no shouting match caught on someone's phone. I came home early one afternoon after a treatment session got cut short, and a bank statement was sitting on the kitchen counter addressed to me for an account I had never opened. My sister's name was listed on it as a co-holder. I stood there reading it twice before the words fully landed, and then I went looking for an explanation and found Todd's phone unlocked on the counter beside it, mid-conversation with Vanessa, a thread that went back 11 months. 11 months. I did that math sitting on my own bathroom floor, still in a hospital gown I hadn't bothered to take off. 11 months meant this hadn't started because I got sick. It had started before any of us knew anything was wrong with me at all. My getting sick hadn't caused what was happening in my own house. It had simply made it easier for it to keep happening without anyone noticing, including me, the one person who should have. I sat on that floor for a long time before I moved. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had two choices in front of me. I could fall apart completely, which some part of me genuinely wanted to do, or I could get up, get dressed, and start figuring out exactly how deep this actually went, because a bank statement with my sister's name on it wasn't a detail that belonged to an affair story. It belonged to something else entirely, something with paperwork and signatures and a timeline that needed to be understood before I said a single word to either one of them. That's the part almost nobody believes when I tell them this story now, years later. What started as a betrayal between a husband and a wife didn't stay there. It turned into a financial investigation that I ended up running myself from a chemo chair, exhausted, alone, because I quickly understood that nobody else was going to do that work for me. And the money mattered every bit as much as the marriage did, maybe more, given what I still had ahead of me medically and what it was going to cost. I confronted Todd first, in our kitchen, with the statement between us on the counter. He didn't deny it. He said it just happened, that he was scared, that he didn't know how to handle any of it once it started, as if fear were an explanation instead of a description. I confronted Vanessa separately, and her response was worse in a way I wasn't prepared for. She didn't apologize. She reframed it. She told me I hadn't been present, that someone had to step up while I was gone, as though my illness were an abandonment she was simply responding to. I stopped asking either of them for honesty after that, because I understood I wasn't going to get any. Instead, I started pulling records, one document at a time, in whatever hours I had energy for between treatments. The first thing I found was a form I barely remembered signing, something Vanessa had described to me at the time as a medical convenience document, meant to let her handle small things on my behalf during appointments. It wasn't small. It was closer to a limited power of attorney, and she had used it to redirect a portion of a disability payout that should have come to me. The second thing I found was the account itself, the one with both our names on it. I had never signed anything authorizing it. When my attorney later had the signature examined, it matched an old document of mine closely enough to fool a bank teller, but not closely enough to survive real scrutiny. Someone had scanned my signature from something else entirely and used it to open that account without my knowledge. The third thing I found took the longest to see, because it wasn't one large theft, it was dozens of small ones. Todd had been moving money out of our joint accounts in small increments for months, amounts easy to miss individually on a single statement, but devastating once I lined every statement up next to each other on my kitchen table and finally saw the whole pattern at once instead of one page at a time. For a while, I let myself believe Todd might have been the one driving all of it, that Vanessa had simply been pulled along by a man who knew how to make bad decisions feel reasonable. I wanted, honestly, for there to be one clear villain in this story, instead of two people who had each made their own choices for their own reasons. That belief didn't survive very long once the fuller picture came into focus. I thought at that point that I finally had the whole story. I thought the worst thing my sister had done was fall in love with my husband while I was too sick to notice or defend what was mine. I was wrong about which betrayal was actually the larger one, and I didn't understand how wrong until my attorney sat me down and walked me through a timeline I hadn't been able to see clearly on my own. I want to pause here and say something plainly, because I think it matters to anyone listening who has ever been underestimated while they were down. I was exhausted that year in ways I can't fully describe to someone who hasn't lived through treatment. But exhausted is not the same as careless, and foggy is not the same as blind. I kept copies of things. I asked questions even when I was too tired to like the answers. That habit is the only reason any of what comes next was possible at all. Here is what my attorney showed me, laid out on a conference table with dates on one side and documents on the other. The forged power of attorney wasn't something Vanessa improvised in a moment of opportunity once I got sick. She had consulted a lawyer months before my diagnosis was even finalized to understand exactly what she would legally be able to redirect if something happened to me. Something happened to me is the phrase used in the notes from that consultation. Not if I got sick. Not if I needed help. If something happened to me. I sat with that sentence for a long time before I could speak again. This wasn't an affair that eventually turned into financial opportunism once the door was open. The financial planning came first. The affair, as devastating as it was to live through, was almost incidental to a calculation my own sister had already been quietly running before I had even fully absorbed my own diagnosis myself. You can forgive somebody, eventually, for falling in love with the wrong person. People do that. It's a human failure I understand even when it costs me something. What I could not get past, what I still have not fully gotten past, was realizing my sister had consulted a lawyer about my potential death as a financial event before I had a completed treatment plan of my own. That isn't heartbreak. That's something colder than heartbreak, and I needed new language just to hold it. The case that followed wasn't a divorce filing dressed up as drama for an audience. It became a civil fraud case, breach of fiduciary duty, forged documents, redirected disability funds, all of it documented and filed and taken seriously by people whose job it is to take exactly this kind of thing seriously. I sat through depositions still bald from treatment, still recovering from surgery, answering questions about bank routing numbers, because I refused to let exhaustion be the reason this went unresolved. There was a version of this year where I simply didn't have the energy to fight for the money, where I let it go because fighting felt like more than I had left to give. I understand why some people choose that version. I want to be honest that I came close to it more than once. What kept me from choosing it wasn't anger, in the end. It was something closer to a promise I'd made to myself a long time before any of this happened, one I didn't fully understand the shape of until I needed it. I won the financial case. The redirected funds came back, along with a judgment that made clear on paper exactly what had been done and by whom. Todd, by that point, expected me to cut him off entirely and completely, financially and otherwise, and braced himself for it the way you brace for something you know you've earned. What he didn't expect, what genuinely surprised him in that final meeting with our attorneys, was learning that I'd kept detailed records of everything from the very beginning, not out of some calculated plan for revenge, but because of something that happened long before either of them ever entered my life. 13 years earlier, my own mother lost nearly everything she had in a strikingly similar family financial betrayal, orchestrated by someone she trusted completely and never suspected until it was far too late for her to recover most of it. I watched what that did to her in the years afterward, how much of herself she had to rebuild from almost nothing at an age when rebuilding is harder than anyone wants to admit. I made myself a quiet promise after that, one I never spoke out loud to anyone, that I would never again let myself be caught that unprepared, no matter how much I trusted the people closest to me. They thought sick meant slow. They thought exhausted meant careless, meant an easy target, meant someone too worn down to keep track of her own life while she was busy trying to survive it. What neither of them understood is that I come from a woman who taught me, the hard way, to keep my own copies of everything, a long time before I ever imagined I'd need to use that lesson myself. Was justice really served? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count since the case closed. The money came back, every dollar eventually, with interest the court required. The marriage did not come back, and I no longer wanted it to by the time the case concluded. My sister and I have not spoken in 3 years, and I genuinely don't know, even now, whether that silence is a wound that's still open or a boundary that finally healed something in me I didn't know needed healing. I know it's the truth, whichever one it turns out to be. I think about the version of me sitting on that bathroom floor sometimes, still in a hospital gown, doing math I never wanted to learn how to do. I don't know if I'd tell her it gets easier. I think I'd tell her something closer to the truth, which is that it gets clearer, even when it doesn't get easier, and clarity turned out to be the thing that actually got me through the rest of it. If you were in my position, in those first few weeks before you even understood what was really happening around you, I want to know honestly what you think you would have done differently. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, even the ones that disagree with choices I made, because I think this story only means something if people are actually willing to sit with the hard parts of it instead of the easy version. And if you thought a spreadsheet was the coldest thing a family member could hand you, wait until you hear what the next family in this series had already filed with their bank 3 years before anyone in that house had even gotten sick at all. That one still gets to me, and I've heard a lot of these stories by now. Before we go, if this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the next one when it drops. These stories don't stay up everywhere, and I don't want you to miss what's coming.